Hey guys, it's Olivia. Welcome back to your endocrine chapter. So in this video, we're going to be covering some of the anatomical locations of our endocrine glands and just some of the basic jobs so that you're familiar with these glands when we get into some of the more specifics of the pathology that surrounds them later in this unit. So the first gland that I want to talk to you guys about is the pineal gland. And our pineal gland is going to be located behind the third ventricle. So if you look over here, you can see that your pineal gland is very small. It's right behind this third ventricle in this diagram. And its main job is to regulate your circadian rhythm or your sleep-wake cycle through secreting melatonin. Melatonin you guys have probably heard of as an over-the-counter supplement that has gained a lot of popularity, and the pineal gland is going to be the gland that is responsible for secreting melatonin naturally, physiologically in your body, thereby controlling your sleep-wake cycle and your circadian rhythm. So a very important gland, a very mighty gland, even though it is incredibly small. Now the next gland that I want to talk to you guys about is your hypothalamus. And even though it's not labeled on your diagram here, your hypothalamus is exactly where it sounds like it should be, right beneath your thalamus. And it is going to be the gland that connects our thalamus and the pituitary gland. So it's going to serve as a really important connection between our nervous system, our brain, right? The thalamus is part of your brain, and the endocrine system. Because our pituitary gland, of course, is an important player in our endocrine system. The hypothalamus also has some additional key jobs. So it produces two hormones. It makes ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. You may also know this as vasopressin, very important for your body's retention of water and regulating the concentration of your urine, as well as oxytocin. And oxytocin you might know as a hormone that has several different effects. It can play into your brain chemistry. It's also incredibly important for stimulating uterine contractions in a woman during labor. So these are going to be two important hormones that are made by the hypothalamus. However, they're actually stored in the posterior pituitary. So you're going to hear them in relation to the posterior pituitary as well. And that might actually be a more important association to remember because the concentration of ADH and oxytocin in your body is going to be regulated by how much of these hormones are released from the posterior pituitary. So these hormones are going to be made by the hypothalamus pretty frequently, but it's how much of them are released from where they're stored in the posterior pituitary that is going to change the biological, physiological response here. Now, the hypothalamus also is going to regulate release of hormones from the anterior pituitary, again, kind of functioning as that intermediate or that communication center between the nervous system and the endocrine system and regulating release of hormones from the anterior pituitary that way. Now, descending more inferiorly, our next gland that we're going to talk about is your pituitary gland. And your pituitary gland is right here, right beneath the hypothalamus, because that's what it communicates with. Now, your pituitary gland is a pea-sized gland. It's very small. And even though it's pictured over here, kind of floating in space, you can see it kind of distended and floating in space. It actually has a very important anatomical relationship with your skull. So if you look over here, down here at this image, you can see that your pituitary gland is sitting right here in part of the sphenoid bone that is called the sella turcica. And sella turcica means Turkish saddle. It's kind of this hollowed out saddle-shaped area that the pituitary gland sits in. And this is going to be a really important anatomical relationship because right above the sella turcica is our optic nerve. So our optic nerve sits right above the sella turcica, and in the sella turcica, that is where our pituitary gland lives. And that's totally fine under normal physiologic conditions. However, if we have any sort of pathology that is going to cause an enlargement of that pituitary gland, oftentimes this will be a prolactinoma or some other type of tumor that is going to enlarge the pituitary gland, then you can get compression of that optic nerve. And if you get compression of that optic nerve, you can get what we call a bilateral temporal hemianopsia, which is just a really fancy way of saying you lose your peripheral vision. So I would lose this part of my vision in both of my eyes, and that can be one complication from having an enlarged pituitary gland, which of course makes sense if you know where the pituitary gland is located in relation to the optic nerve in the sella turcica. Now, a little bit more about the pituitary gland and what it actually does. First, we have our anterior pituitary gland, so part of the pituitary gland that's in the front, and this anterior pituitary is going to release a bunch of hormones that regulate growth, thyroid hormone release, and also sex hormone release. So I like to think of the anterior pituitary as kind of like the control center for our growth and sexual hormones and our thyroid hormones as well. These hormones are going to be growth hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormones, that's going to be regulating the release of cortisol, FSH and LH, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone. These are going to be regulating release of our sex hormones. thyroid stimulating hormone. That, of course, is going to regulate the release of our thyroid hormones. And then last, prolactin. And prolactin is going to be kind of a unique hormone here because it is going to be stimulating our lactation. And it's actually going to be the hormone that is most commonly released in the most common tumor of the pituitary, which is going to be a prolactinoma. So a prolactinoma is going to cause increased release of prolactin. You might see lactation or continued lactation in a woman after childbirth when she thinks she otherwise shouldn't be lactating, as well as you might see this bitemporal hemianopsia because these patients are going to have that enlarged pituitary that is squishing their optic nerve and giving them vision deficits. So if you ever hear anything about lactation, gynecomastia, and vision deficits, you should be thinking a prolactinoma, and it should definitely be on your differential. Next, we're going to talk about the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary only has two hormones. They're the hormones we talked about earlier, ADH and oxytocin. These are going to be made in the hypothalamus. They're made in the hypothalamus, but they're stored in the posterior pituitary, and that is where the release is going to be regulated. Now, the next gland that I want you guys to be aware of is your thyroid gland. And we're just marching down the body here. If you look over here, your thyroid gland is right on the anterior neck, inferior to your thyroid cartilage. And the job of the thyroid gland is when it's stimulated by TSH, it's going to produce our T4 and T3. These are our thyroid hormones. Usually we produce T4 and that gets converted to T3 peripherally. And T4 and T3 are going to be very important for regulating temperature, metabolism, heart rate. I always kind of think of your thyroid hormones as regulating your body's metabolism. So how fast are we running? How hot are we running? How fast are we digesting things? And that's why you'll see thyroid hormone or levothyroxine often abused in weight loss clinics, etc., because you can really mess with your metabolism, but also your heart rate and your temperature this way. So a very dangerous use of this hormone, but an effective one to lose weight. Now, the next gland that I want to talk to you guys about is the parathyroid glands. And the parathyroid glands, para, again, meaning near or beside, are located throughout the thyroid glands. So these little dots here are going to be your parathyroid glands, and their job is to make PTH, or parathyroid hormone. The parathyroid glands make the parathyroid hormone. And the parathyroid hormone, its main job is to regulate calcium levels in your body, and it's a kind of a complex mechanism that we'll go into in a different video. But parathyroid hormone, basically either through renal reabsorption of calcium or through bone breakdown, which releases calcium, is going to regulate the amount of calcium available in your body and make sure that you always have an appropriate amount available. Next, let's talk about your adrenal glands. Adrenal glands are located above each kidney, and sometimes they are referred to as your suprarenal glands because they are supra or more superior to your kidneys, and their job is to produce steroid hormones. So they make cortisol, aldosterone, and androgens. So even though they're very tiny little glands that are little hats on top of your kidneys, they have a very important role in the body. Next, let's talk about your pancreas, which is located more in your epigastric region. You can see the head of the pancreas over here, and then the tail of the pancreas extending more into the left upper quadrant. Your pancreas is going to be important for producing insulin and glucagon. So whenever we talk about diabetes or whenever we talk about a disorder of insulin or glucagon, I want you to be thinking about your pancreas. The next gland that we'll talk about are your ovaries and your testes. So your ovaries and your testes, of course, are going to be your reproductive glands, but they're also an important part of the endocrine systems. So your ovaries over here, of course, are making your estrogens, and your testes over here, of course, are making your androgens. And even though you might be more familiar with these as reproductive glands, they are an important endocrine gland as well and should be mentioned in this system. Finally, let's talk about your adipose cells. Your adipose cells, I think, are one of the most counterintuitive parts of the endocrine system, but they're actually incredibly important because your fat cells contain aromatase, and aromatase is an enzyme that is responsible for converting androgens to estrogens. So your fat cells, or the amount of fat cells you have in your body, can play a very important role in the endocrine system in determining the ratio of androgens to estrogens. So we've made it through all the glands in the endocrine system. Let's quickly review. So first we have our pineal gland. Our pineal gland is this P right behind the third ventricle. It makes melatonin. Then we have our hypothalamus right beneath that. The hypothalamus is the communication center between our thalamus and the brain, and our pituitary gland. Our pituitary gland is going to be very important, and we divide that up into our anterior pituitary and our posterior pituitary. Our anterior pituitary releases a ton of hormones: GH, ACTH, FSH, LH, and TSH, and prolactin. So the anterior pituitary releases all these hormones that are going to have have downstream effects on our other endocrine glands. And then our posterior pituitary only has two hormones, ADH and oxytocin, that are both made in the hypothalamus but stored in the posterior pituitary. Next, we have our thyroid gland, and our thyroid gland is located in our anterior neck. Thyroid gland is going to be responsible for making thyroid hormones that regulate temperature, metabolism, and heart rate. Then we have our parathyroid glands that are scattered throughout our thyroid glands. Our parathyroid glands have one job. They make PTH to regulate calcium levels. Then we have our adrenal glands, or our suprarenal glands. They are right on top of our kidneys, and they are going to be producing our steroid hormones like cortisol, aldosterone, and androgens. Then we have our pancreas. Our pancreas, located in your epigastric region, is going to be responsible for producing insulin and glucagon, so very important in pathologies like diabetes. Then we have our sex glands, so we have our ovaries and we have our testes that are reproductive glands but part of the endocrine system as well. And then finally, we mentioned how adipose cells actually contain aromatase and can have important downstream endocrine effects and should be included as a part of this system as well. So that was a quick overview of all of our endocrine glands. How would they ask you about this on step 1? Well, there's a lot of ways they could ask you about this in a lot more detail, but something that you might be able to answer from this video is a question like, a woman is in the second stage of labor and undergoing uterine contractions. From where does the hormone causing her contractions originate? Well, because you watched this video, you know that the hormone that causes uterine contractions is likely oxytocin. And the question is asking you, where does this hormone originate? Well, oxytocin, we know, is stored and released by the posterior pituitary. It originates, however, and is synthesized in the hypothalamus. So hypothalamus would actually be your answer for this question, and I've seen students get this wrong on many practice tests, but because you watched this video, you know the difference between where oxytocin is synthesized in the hypothalamus and where it is stored in the posterior pituitary, and you would get that question correct. Now, I hope this video was helpful, and I'll see you next time.